Dear participants, dear speakers, dear organizers, let me welcome you all to a new REMOURBAN Webinar. We advise the audience that this webinar will be recorded and that its recording will be published in REMOURBAN's website and REMOURBAN's YouTube channel. My name is Mathieu Grosjean and I will moderate this webinar. I work in the field of innovation management in the headquarters of Steinbeiß Europa Zentrum, located in the city of Stuttgart in Germany. If you want to know more about this project, REMOURBAN, the smart city solutions that are being put to the test in different European cities and the opportunities that they may hold for you and your organization, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. We will be glad to help you. During today's session, 3 experts involved in the project will discuss the particular approach taken in the deep building retrofitting actions being carried out as part of Nottingham City's role within the project. Starting on January 2015, REMOURBAN's ultimate goal is to develop a holistic and highly replicable urban regeneration model throughout concrete demonstrations in 3 lighthouse cities: Nottingham, Tepe-Bachi, and Valladolid, while 2 follower cities, Miskolc and Seraing in Belgium, have expressed their interest in replicating those experiences. The project is financed with funds coming from the European Union's Horizon 2020 program to foster research and innovation. In that context, Nottingham has gone through a really interesting experience, as it is the first city in the United Kingdom to adopt a new approach towards how to carry out public procurement when pursuing the deep retrofit of old buildings. This change of perspective has improved 10 hard-to-hit homes and turned them into zero net emissions homes in record time. As you might notice, your microphones have been muted. This is to prevent any interruptions while the speakers carry out their presentations. As the topic of today's agenda are presented, you may have comments or questions for our speakers. If that is your case, please don't hesitate to write them down in the everyone's chat box. I will collect them during the course of the presentations and ask them, the speakers, to the speakers in the dedicated sessions for questions and answers at the end of these presentations. Now that we are done with the introductory words, let me give you an overview of what's coming next. 3 speakers will tackle the topic of this webinar from different perspectives. First, Emily Braham, Head of Sustainable Energy at Nottingham City Homes, will discuss on how to procure an energy performance guarantee in deep building retrofitting projects. She asserts, set your outcomes and objectives for procurement rather than purchasing a predefined construction solution. Second, Jonathan Whitmarsh, Corporate Procurement Officer at Nottingham City Council, will explain how this differs from the traditional procurement process and what are the implications and approaches for procurement professionals. The third and final presentation of this webinar is taken over by David Adams, Technical Director at Melius Homes. He will tell us his own experience as the contractor of this new process. He assures it's an opportunity and not a threat to the construction process. Finally, we will conclude with a question and answer session. So let's get started. The floor is all yours, Emily.
Thank you, Matthew. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So I'm going to start off just by talking a little bit about a typical procurement exercise and how we've done it before and how we're still doing it in many areas of construction at the moment. So for typical procurement exercises, we ask for the lowest cost typically up front, and we make contractors bid against a specification which we've developed or partly developed as the client, even if the contractor doesn't think that's the optimum to achieve what we're looking for. And they have to play the game to win, so they have to submit a compliant bid, which is often the lowest cost one. And sometimes it's about who writes the best bid rather than what they can actually offer in terms of quality. As part of submitting the lowest cost bid, contractors have to find the potential gaps and the commercial opportunities in the tender which they can then exploit. And that immediately puts the client and the contractor against each other, and the contract starts off with a race to the bottom of price and often therefore quality. Effectively, as a client, we often end up accidentally rewarding those who supply inferior products with a contract, and then we spend the next 20 years paying more money to maintain or replace the inferior products. Often the project outcome is that costs go up, clients feel as though they aren't getting value for money and the quality isn't as good as it could be, not through any fault of the contractor, but because the contractor has been set up in that way. And then, talking about procuring innovation, procurement is challenging at the best of times. So how do you then procure something which doesn't actually exist yet? And when you're concerned that there are very few suppliers who can provide what you're asking for, and you're not entirely sure what you are asking for. And this is where we were with our Energiesprong project. So as the first in the UK, the model hadn't been used before, and it fundamentally changed what we were asking for. So we wanted a performance outcome to meet 2050 net zero energy standards, but we didn't know exactly what performance could be achieved on the properties or what performance could be achieved cost effectively. We wanted the whole life cost, the lowest whole life cost and the best quality, but having no benchmark made it difficult to have any idea what we would get offered by bidders. And therefore that made it really difficult to structure the tender and to develop the evaluation process. There was a lot of kind of scratching our heads and thinking about, if we put this in, what will that result in terms of bids, and is that what we really want? We looked at whether we could use any existing frameworks, but there weren't any that were suitable, and we knew that there were only a handful of suppliers who were interested, and they weren't all on one framework. But whilst we were looking around at options, we did discover a framework in the south of the UK which had an option for doing a two-stage tender and paying contractors a fee for the second stage, which enabled them to submit designs. And that appealed as that was something that we wanted to. The contractor is responsible for the design, and having some level of design to evaluate was one of the challenges and something that would have made that easier. We also looked at whether we could do an innovation competition and met with Innovate UK. That was really to find out how they approached them. It wasn't suitable and they didn't have time to support us because they were so busy. It would have taken 12 months before they could actually help us. But actually meeting with them gave us some really interesting questions that we could ask as well. So we spent a lot of time doing research and thinking about how best to get what we wanted. So our approach, the Energiesprong model, and our approach was about asking for a new product. So usually when we're procuring energy retrofit works, we'd specify particular U values or details, and in doing that we'd ensure that we were partly responsible for the work that was done. And then if it doesn't work, it's partly our fault for specifying something, or at least there's a bit of a battle at that point to try and work out whose fault it is. And again, going back to that kind of scenario where contractors have to provide what we've asked for, even if they don't think that's actually what we want. And we don't really care about what the U value of the material is, for example, but we do care whether it actually generates the energy savings, and we care what it looks like, and we care whether it's safe. So we started thinking about what are those actual outcomes that we're looking for. So the Energiesprong model requires a maximum, a guaranteed performance for 30 years, and in that we asked for a maximum tenant cost as part of that guaranteed performance. So the maximum tenant cost was £300 per year for tenants to run their property. We also wanted it to look great, and it had to get planning approval. There are a number of other sort of performance outcomes that are required. So that comes down to the level of detail as sort of kilowatt hours per metre squared for heating performance, and some comfort factors around being able to get to the right temperatures in the different rooms. And also time on site. So we asked the contractors to be able to do this in 15 days. And for the commercial evaluation part of this, as a landlord who owns and maintains their homes for the foreseeable future, what we actually care about is the total life cost. So that's the capital cost and the operating cost. So we evaluated the whole life costs in this tender, but not the upfront cost. Because we had a fixed capital budget, we set the upfront cost, and we asked the contractors solely to compete on the whole life cost. In subsequent procurement exercises that Energiesprong UK has been doing after that, they've created a methodology of evaluating the capital and the whole life cost jointly. It was one of the challenges in ours was to set a capital cost, which actually we didn't know whether that could be achieved. And in hindsight, it probably wasn't the right capital cost because the bidders found it difficult to actually achieve what we asked for that price. But one of the reasons for doing that was that we couldn't work out how that weighting would work for ongoing whole life cost and upfront capital cost without having some idea of where we were going to end up. We also wanted to create a long-term partnership, and that allowed the opportunity to improve and to reduce costs over a long period. So we procured for 10 certain properties that were going ahead, but with an option to extend to up to 400. And in order to extend that, we needed to get grant funding. So there were some requirements for the client, but also we needed to show a cost reduction, we needed to show value and an improvement on the business model. And we had to set out how we would evaluate that moving forward in order to give us some flexibility for the partnership to move forward and improve the business model without having fixed points that we had to hit. The Energiesprong model requires us to generate revenues as well as offsetting future costs for maintenance and energy. And revenues are often incentives to adjust imperfect market conditions, which means they change. So things like the feed-in tariff, the renewable heat incentive, grid balancing, demand-side response revenues. So our model had to allow flexibility to maximise revenues through changing the specification as we moved forward. We also had to consider, for both the whole life cost and the revenue income, how we would consider over a 30-year period inflation, for example. So how do we actually evaluate all of these things technically to end up with a score in a procurement exercise? So the tender process, which Jonathan will talk more on in a minute, but the tender process we selected was a two-stage competitive dialogue, and the initial part of the competitive dialogue was carried out collectively with all of the bidders that we'd taken through to that stage, and we chose to pay the bidders £10,000 each for design fees for the second stage, which meant that they could put some resource into coming up with the designs, which was the idea that we got from the framework in the south. We evaluated the whole life cost, and we had a schedule which bidders had to complete with time and cost of parts, and we priced this against our schedule of rates for Nottingham City Homes, which made it fairer, and it also made it realistic because Nottingham will continue to maintain the properties, but in line with the maintenance plan set up by the contractor. And we evaluated design, which is a bit tricky because it's so subjective. So we included planners in our evaluation team as well as tenants, and their views fed into how we marked the design element. We also included a tenant wish list, which consisted of design features and a design brief, and it was partly trying to make it less subjective because then we could score how closely bidders met the design brief. So I've touched on some of the challenges, but just in summary for those, I think trying to set a fixed price without any benchmarking data was challenging, and it did mean that we had some non-compliant bids because they couldn't achieve the cost that we'd requested. Similarly, setting a performance specification was difficult because the properties were particularly challenging, and we'd worked with Energiesprong UK and the members of Energiesprong UK for about a year, having workshops where supply chain and housing providers talked through potential performance specification details. Allowing flexibility was a challenge, so we managed to include a clause which gave us some flexibility to tweak the performance specification, which was really essential for the rollout phase. We didn't need it for the pilot, but in the rollout, for example, if there were trees where it's going to impact on the generation of solar power, then we're going to have to be flexible. It's a big challenge to develop a contract with schedules which dealt with 30 years of performance, and understanding how to structure the contract best to allow the partnering and continuous improvement which we were seeking, and also design, which I've touched on about being subjective. One of the other challenges is how do you actually evaluate the performance and trying to write that in up front. And again, it's a sort of future gazing, thinking about what could happen and the scenarios that you might come across and that you might have to deal with, and then trying to put that into a procurement and a contract. So the final one for me, in summary, typically we procure new build and retrofit solutions based on lowest upfront costs, which often means we get inferior products and they cost us more over the long term. And we are in this for the long term. We're managing our assets forever, so why are we not basing our decisions on that? So you've got to think about the outcome. What is it that you're really asking for? What is it that you really want from this exercise? Consider the relationship that you want with the contractor. Should you be working against each other or should you be working together? Is long-term improvement of the service or product or system important? And if so, consider how you achieve that as a partnership. A procurement exercise might last 12 months with all the preparation, which can feel really long and really painful at times. But if you're procuring an ongoing relationship with a contractor or a service or solution which impacts on your assets for the long term, it's worth putting the time in up front to get the procurement exercise right. And procurement officers approaching procurement with a can-do attitude makes loads of difference. Finding ways to overcome challenges is essential to an innovative procurement exercise. If it's innovative, it's not the way things are usually done. And as a project team, it's important to accept that the plan is to do things differently and to work out how to deliver what you want within the rules and regulations. And when you're doing something like this, the other thing is to involve the tenants. So involve the people who are living in the properties, because they really understand their properties and they know how best what they're looking for out of that procurement exercise. And it also then gives them ownership of the project to move forward. I'm now going to pass on to Jonathan to talk about facilitating the process.
Thank you for your insights, Emily. Let's now move to the characteristics of this new procurement process and how to ease it. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Right, that should be working. Can you hear me okay? Somebody? Anybody?
Yes, perfect.
Ah, lovely. Excellent. Right. Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jonathan. I'm a lead procurement officer at Nottingham City Council. For my sins, I seem to get attached to all the fun projects in inverted commas, by which people mean complicated and difficult. But this one has been fun, so it's well worthwhile. Procurement is one of those subjects, if you're involved in it a lot, it can be quite interesting. If you're not, it's quite often seen as a bit dry and quite often just gets in the way of achieving things, which is always a bit problematic. Fortunately on this one, I think we started off with a very clear idea of what the end result was wanted, which does help. I don't know how acquainted people are with the procurement procedures, but broadly speaking, there's the 4 ones shown on the slide. The open procedure is straightforward, go out and invite tenders come back in, evaluate them, best one wins. The restricted expands out slightly by having an initial stage where you can get people to send you their company details back, you evaluate them on past experience, capability, that kind of thing, and if need be shortlist them, then invite tenders from a smaller pool of bidders. The competitive procedure with negotiation, that's one of the new ones that came in the 2014 EU directive, which expands the concept a bit by getting to the initial tender stage, and then if you have the initial tenders in and you're happy with them, you can award straight away. But if there's things that aren't quite right, you then get the option to move on to a dialogue with the bidders and try and improve their tenders, not necessarily dramatically change it, but kind of funnel them towards a more desirable outcome. The competitive dialogue, I think it's the least frequently used of these, and possibly because it's a bit more open-ended and people struggle to get their heads around with it. So it starts off broadly the same as the restricted one. So you go out for expressions of interest, companies that are interested send you their details and you can kind of filter them out. So anyone that, in this instance, fundamentally wasn't set up for doing something like this project, you can kind of, thanks very much, but leave by the wayside. And rather than inviting initial tenders, you just launch straight into a dialogue with the companies. So you've got an idea of your outcomes. They would presumably be coming in with a bit of an idea of how they're going to achieve that. But rather than having to put it all down on paper in a formal tender format, you just go straight into the dialogue, start talking to them about it. And in our case, we did have the initial meeting where everyone came in a room together. I have to say, people in my field are a bit kind of wary about that, because you think if you're putting competing tenderers in a room together, they're not likely to kind of let all their secrets out. I think in practice, some of them possibly were a bit cagey during that first meeting, but because a lot of it was around initial discussions on things like the performance specifications, what might be possible within the budgets, I think there was quite a lot of useful information came out of that, so well worth doing. We then moved on to sort of dialogue with the individual bidders on their own to talk about their specific solutions to the problems. And that was probably the key to this whole process, in that we started off with very much an open idea of what we want to do, and then gave bidders the option to come in and tell us how they propose to do it. This next slide, I'm just going to run quickly through the competitive dialogue procedure. The key features of it, as I said, you start off with the initial expression of interest. If you're doing the full OG version, it's a minimum of 30 days. Anyone that's interested can apply. You put out a standard kind of set of selection questions that they send you back in. The shortlisting bit, we had intended to shortlist down to 5 or 6 to take through to the next stage. In practice, we only got 3 applications, which in hindsight is probably about right for a fairly specialist requirement with not many market sort of operators. So that worked out quite nicely. It saved us a bit of work on that front, and then went into dialogue on the 3. I think the key feature from a procurement point of view is, because we had obviously Emily involved in the dialogue, and she had kind of consultants to tap into, a gentleman called Arno who was sort of very knowledgeable about the energy side, with people from Energiesprong supporting on things like the legal side and the fine details. So at that point, from a procurement perspective, I could more or less take a step back and leave them to it. So my role was one more of a referee at this point, so just making sure no one overstepped the bounds of what they're allowed to do lawfully under the procurement regulations and the way the procedure works, and just letting them have as much dialogue as they needed to work through the rest of the process. The one other key feature with competitive dialogue, I think, I don't know how much it helped in the end on this one because of the outcomes, but certainly would be a very useful feature for this kind of a process, is that ordinarily once you've invited your final tenders and evaluated them, that is the end. You can have no more kind of toing and froing and discussion on the solutions the tender has presented. For competitive dialogue, you do have, it's not exactly a further negotiation, but you've got a bit of scope to do some light tweaking on the final result. So you can firm up financial commitments, for example, or if there's things that, I don't know, things like timings and the fine details where it doesn't affect materially the tender submitted, but you can have a bit more of a just firming up of those details, as long as you're not, as I say, materially modifying the main features of the contract. So, moving on to the last bit, from a procurement standpoint, as I say, it's often seen as being getting in the way a bit. So the key thing, I think, to take away from this one is to focus very clearly on the outcomes of the project rather than trying to dictate the solutions to the bidders. I know for certain if we brought David and Milius into a room and told them how we wanted them to deliver it, it wouldn't have worked anywhere near as well as it did. So you're focusing on the outcomes. The specifications need to be open enough that they know what we want, but not restricting them to a certain solution. So we had a couple of different ideas presented during the dialogue. Some of them, we had one that's a fantastic solution, but exceeded the budget quite substantially, so that's not going to work in practice. You might get solutions in correspondingly that are very, very cheap, but don't ultimately deliver what you want, which would be just as bad from the other side. So clearly setting out your criteria at the start of what you want the end result to be achieved, and then how you're going to measure that. I think Emily touched on that, was a very key one, and that was, I think, the biggest bit of the initial setup that we had to do before we were ready to go out to tender. From the procurement point of view, as I said, if being able getting to a point where I could pretty much just sit back and let Emily and her team have the dialogue with the bidders about the solutions was the best idea. And going into it with this open and collaborative mindset where you're expecting to talk and everyone's participating equally, rather than one side sitting there stony faced while the other one's dictating what they should be doing, which tends to be different to the way procurements are normally run in practice. I think not that necessarily they should be, but it's the way they were. The other key feature with procurements tends to be a risk-averse approach, certainly in local authorities, that they tend to want to nail everything down and get a firm price, and, oh, we don't like that idea, it's a bit different to what we normally do. I'm not saying that you should just kind of throw caution to the wind, but certainly I think for this project, Emily and her team were aware of the risks, and they were happy to kind of take on a bit more risk than we might normally do on a procurement, but without, you know, just leaving everything open and risking everything falling apart at the end of it. The other key feature I found with this one, more of a practical standpoint, is that there was a very clear buy-in from stakeholders involved. So as Emily mentioned, the tenants were consulted, they were given kind of interviews and previews and got to talk to the bidders at one point about sort of their aspirations. The planners were involved. That's obviously quite important because it's going to have to get through planning consent and the rest. We also got the local councillors, the ward councillors involved. So they were on board with the concept. They understood what the process was going to be and what the outcomes were aiming for, and they were quite happy to run with that. And I think that's a key one, certainly for local authorities, because we quite often get to a point where you start to bring the stakeholders in, and if they don't quite understand how you've got to where you are, you often get quite a lot of pushback from it. So I think that's pretty much the summary, is to go into it with flexibility in mind, fixed on the outcomes, but not too focused on how you intended to achieve them until you get to that later point of the process. And I think that's about it from me without getting overly complicated and technical. So, yeah.
Thanks, Jonathan. So, let me remind you, we are approaching the end of this webinar, so please don't forget to write down the question that you might have in everyone's chat box. Now it's David's time to share with us his own experience as a contractor with this new procurement process. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matthew. David Adams, Melius Homes. I think I'll answer this in two ways. The first is just to give a little bit of perhaps a cynical view, albeit it's really truer than you would like to think, contractor approach to a traditional tender, first of all. Effectively, the contractor receives the tender. They broadly seek to understand what's being asked for. Mostly it's client design or significantly client design, so whether that's been done well or not, that's what we are needing to price. When looking at that, we might even go so far as looking for gaps where there might be future commercial opportunities, because at this stage, even if it's price and quality that's being assessed, price is normally very key. In fact, often that is the most powerful driver that the client has expressed through the tender. They want a low cost. So, of course, if there are quality questions, you'd read the quality questions, and often there are, but it is a bit like doing an exam to the point where you will calculate what attributes within each of the questions are likely to give the highest and lowest marks to determine where to spend money or not. You'll also work hard to determine actually whether some of the quality questions differentiate at all. Often it may well ask for attributes that pretty much every company tendering will have, so therefore it's a non-question. And that tips it further towards it being a price-based procurement. But that needs to be understood. It is really like playing Monopoly. Obviously we design the solution which provides the highest score. That doesn't mean it's the best solution for the problem the client is wishing to solve, but this is a tender process, and clearly you may be very virtuous and have the perfect answer, but if you don't score highly, then you will not win. So having reviewed what you think the answer is and compared it with the client's, what you believe the client actually wanted, you then actually decide whether it's worth bidding. And you will look at what are your competitors likely to exploit within the tender question, weaknesses that would allow them to put in a low price, knowing that they'll be able to push the value up once they've won the tender. Because if it's got lots of those areas, again, there's a question as to whether it's worth tendering if that's not the kind of game that you wish to play. So in a traditional sense, it is all about answering what the client actually asked for in writing and not going any further than that because you can't afford to. Switching though to an outcome-based procurement, completely different, chalk and cheese. It's really important that the contractor understands what the client really needs, bearing in mind that may not be what they've actually expressed. It may be coming from other clues, from the planners, from meeting with the tenants, from actually having a conversation with the client to get to what's really important, rather than what they, in a darkened room, wrote down on a piece of paper, which is hard for anyone to do. Second is, it's a really creative design process. Because the tenderer now has to come forward with that solution to answer the particular outcomes the client is looking for, knowing full well those outcomes will be measured, i.e. there is a real day of reckoning. This isn't designing for compliance, this is designing for outcome performance. And that, certainly in our case, meant we needed to rely strongly on a multi-skilled team of pretty talented people to undertake the tender. Because it's very transparent to the client. You're sat in discussions, presenting ideas, discussing them. It's very clear whether you know what you're talking about or not. You can't hide it in very well worded written answer. You are very much in front of them, having to show what you can do. And that provides a real, true opportunity to optimize, to challenge perhaps some of the previously held beliefs, to check whether that is really what they want or whether that's perception, and also in a limited budget to test if they've asked or seem to want 5 different things and they all look even, which is the most important. And you've got that process through the competitive dialogue to really get to grips with what are the key issues here and focus on those. That allows the optimization of the solution, but it also allows minimizing of risk. And I mean minimizing, not simply handing the risk on to someone else in the supply chain. Minimizing risk means that we lower costs, not simply shift it. So it becomes a partnered approach, albeit one where the client ultimately makes, of course, the decision, and the contractor ultimately is responsible for ensuring that output spec is met. Just because they developed it with conversation with the client doesn't shift that responsibility, whereas a traditional tender, typically it does. And that does take time, but don't be scared about that. That time is extremely well spent because you're getting along that curve, which shortens the project delivery time. There are challenges though for contractors. There are long-term risks here that the contractor, especially in this tender, was taking on, we were taking on, and there is no revenue stream against them. That is going to be a challenge, and is a challenge. And also, because this had energy performance outcomes, it was really important we understood what really performed and what doesn't. Yet, as a whole industry, the industry having not been asked for that before, normally asked for compliance, not performance, who knows? Quite a few of these things we simply didn't know how things really performed in use, and therefore we had to make judgments. We will know better next time, and it's a learning curve, but that's also quite a challenge. The neat thing about this process, it's much harder or pretty much impossible to game. We simply have to focus all the effort on producing the outcomes the client's needing, and it's a very honest space for us to understand and the client to understand where the opportunities and challenges lie within that space. So that also leads to another key element of this, which is it is a process which does build a strong relationship with that client, which means that there are opportunities for both parties on an ongoing basis beyond that single project. So from a contractor perspective, not to be underestimated how different this is, but those differences are positive. Therefore, it is really worth getting head around, and I hope that we'll have more of these type of opportunities going forward. That's it from me.
Thank you, David. So at this point, all three speakers have made their presentations, and I have to say that it has been really interesting to get both Nottingham's and the contractor's view on this subject. Okay, so it seems that there are no questions from the participants, but I do have a question myself. Do you agree with the idea that this new approach towards government's procurement in deep building retrofitting projects facilitates or make more room for the market deployment of innovative building solutions, which may not be broadly expanded in the market yet? Maybe we can send this question for Emily or David.
I think we're on.
Matthew, could you just say the question again? Sorry, we were just trying to get the microphone to work again.
No problem. Do you agree with the idea that this new approach towards government's procurement in deep building retrofitting projects facilitates or makes more room for the market deployment of innovative building solutions, which may not be broadly expanded in the market yet?
Definitely, yes. I think asking for an outcome, the outcome that we're asking for, I think it's worth saying that it's not something that's being delivered because it's such a high performance outcome. So we're asking for the homes to generate enough electricity for the tenants' own energy consumption as well to make them net zero, and that requires a big shift in technology and a big shift in the way that these solutions are delivered. We're asking for them to be done in 15 days on site. That requires off-site fabrication and manufacturing, and giving the performance focus and the outcome focus means that solution providers can innovate and they can come up with their own solutions. And what we're trying to do here with the work that we're doing with other housing providers as well now in the UK is to come up with a large-scale demand asking for the same performance outcome, which gives solution providers enough incentive to go off and do that innovation and to invest in their own research and development so that they can produce the solutions that we're looking for as housing providers more cost effectively at large scale. So I think it's developing that framework within which we can demand more and suppliers can actually meet that demand.
Can I just add to that a little bit? And it's going back to some of the points that David touched on. Tendering is, and it's usually seen as competitive tenders because you're competing with bidders against each other, and there is that element where I'm sure any halfway good bidder will be looking at it and seeing where they think they can score the most points, where they think they might have an advantage over their competitors. The traditional model of it is very much pitting them against each other, and it's almost like you throw all the bidders into a pit and then they fight it out and the last one standing wins. This model, as David said, very much different to that in that you're giving everyone that full and open dialogue, and I think that I've done a couple of these, all very similar to this, and they have tended to have better outcomes at the end because of it, because you're not just kind of, here's our criteria, fight it out. You're having that dialogue and people are coming back, and there is the opportunity to say, we see you've written this bit, but there's a better way of doing it, kind of thing. So I think if the key reason I think more people aren't doing things like this is that risk of the unknown, because it is a bit different to what people are used to. They're not quite sure about it works yet, basically. So I think the more tenders like this go out and come back and people are happy with outcomes, the more likely it is to expand in use. And just to touch on one of the points David mentioned about finding sort of the gaps and the wiggle room in tenders, as a procurement professional, I spend a lot of my time trying to find those gaps and close them down in the client specs, because you know full well if you leave enough gap for a contractor to wriggle through and get an advantage, they will find it as well and they will use it. And that's when you end up with sort of the best bid on paper that wins because it scores the most points. And in practice, you're thinking, if only we'd thought about that sooner, if we'd taken that loophole out or changed that weighting on the criteria. So I think there is a lot of room from both sides of the table. If we get feedback from contractors that they are willing and happy to use this kind of process, there's more scope for it in the future. And I know this one I think worked quite well because it was a fairly sort of new, smaller market type requirement. I've had other ones in sort of more standard construction where people have said they would be really happy to go down this sort of route, except the cost of it, and it is expensive for tenderers to be involved in tendering processes. It takes time, they need to put resources into it. So I think definitely offering the payment there helped as well, although obviously that comes down to people's budgets. So I think there is a lot of scope for this kind of a procedure to give real benefits, not only to sort of the council side, but to contractors as well. But it's a lot of it is around changing mindsets, which I think is generally the issue with anything new and innovative. Anyway, that was my take on the question.
Jonathan, if I could add, with regard to the costs of doing it, and therefore contractors' appetite to coming forward, you may find that less contractors for a particular job come forward than something that's traditionally scoped. However, for those that believe that they are able to come up with the innovative solutions and have a strong technical team, I think the conversion rate would be judged as being higher, and therefore, whilst they are likely to bid less jobs, they will win more of them, and therefore, overall, I'm not sure the costs are so different. Tendering for stuff is expensive, and if you're one of 6, one of 10 tendering for something that's specified very clearly by a client, where there is little room for creativity, then you've got a 10% chance. If, however, there are less, yet you have the opportunity to be creative, then it's up to you what your chance is. It depends how good you are. But that's where there is a mindset bit. Contractors need to recognise that and recruit and staff in order to deliver against it. But also the client needs to have the confidence that people will come forward. So as you've said, I think this is something that will grow, but I would certainly encourage people to give it a go, because the outcomes, in certainly my opinion, are far better than the traditional route.
Thank you very much for your answers. While we were speaking a lot about gaps, I was wondering, because of course we are speaking about innovative solutions which are not already on the market, or probably not so famous or well known. There are probably some gaps also in the specification of the needs from the municipality or from the client, and it can be a bit problematic related to the fact that the needs are usually contracted or within the contract. If there is no description of these needs, wouldn't it be a problem for the client? Maybe Jonathan?
Me again. Yes, no, I think you're right. Pretty much always the starting point for going out to the market for something is your specification, and a lot of the success hinges on how well you've set that out in the first place. So if you want, we've done one recently where they wanted kind of innovative designy solutions and then wrote the specification in such a way there was so little wiggle room on the contractor side that they were going to get pretty much the same thing in from everybody. So there you're not innovating at all. If you write out 90% of the design, there's only so much a contractor doing that remaining 10%. Correspondingly, if you go out with such little idea of what you want back, the contractors they're scratching their heads and trying to second guess what it is you're looking for, it's going to take you a while to narrow that down, even using sort of a process like this or the competitive negotiation, because they're starting from such an open cloud of what is it you want that you can't really approach the right solution very quickly. So I think when I was talking about gaps, I was talking about in sort of the wiggle room and specifications. For this one, we started out with the basic idea was this sort of 2050 homes bit about being future-proofed and energy efficient. Sitting behind that was the performance specifications, which I think took a lot of time developing. It was based on something Energiesprong had done before and what we thought was possible. But even within that, there were, I can't remember the full detail, there's several pages worth of elements of specification. I think broadly speaking, some of them were, these are things it absolutely must achieve. Some of them were a bit more open to discussion. And I think this is more sort of the Emily side of things and how that developed over time. But if you've got a very clear idea on the outcome, you can always, as far as the procurement goes, you can set it as this is the ideal outcome, this is where we think we are and move towards it. The over-specifying bit I was talking about earlier is where you say, this is the idea of the outcome and this is how you should achieve it. And if you don't give the contractors enough room to move from your starting position towards the end position, you're not going to get the optimal outcomes from it, I don't think. Now, did that answer the question? Because I've now forgotten what you actually said in the first place.
I think
I was thinking because that. Yeah, I was thinking about the fact that when you are writing specifications, then they will be contracted or they will be written in the contract, and then for the company, it is clear what they have to achieve, and they are responsible for these achievements. And if you have some gaps for this specification, then maybe there can be some drawbacks.
I think
for the
I think though, Matthew, the risk you're describing is much more prevalent in a traditional tendering approach. In this, the client is telling us at quite a headline level what outcomes they're looking for. There are very quantitative ones, how much the energy bill needed to be at the end, and there are qualitative ones. Let's say this needed to be make the homes look desirable, Through the competitive dialogue process, all of those elements are discussed and hammered through, and once that solution has been determined and written down by the tenderer, you then contract to deliver that. So at that point, assuming it's been selected, of course, because they will be judged, but that solution is then written down. And so you only write down the detailed contract once all the creative bit has been done. And that's the critical difference, really. That contractual specification is at the end of the process, it's not at the start.
And if I could just add to that, another feature of this process is you can negotiate on the contract terms as well as the delivery of the specification of the project. So then we started off with an initial set of terms that were from the Energiesprong side of how they've worked. During the course of the dialogue, the bidders would be coming saying, well, this particular term may be overly onerous, or it will inflate their costs, and if we can change that somehow. So there's a lot of leeway for dialogue of every aspect of the tender. I probably didn't hammer that point home earlier enough. As long as you stick with the broad outline of what you're delivering as a basic, and you can't change the award criteria during the process because that's what everyone's working towards at the end. But all the elements you're talking about, the specification, the fine details of contract terms, are all up for negotiation to achieve this best outcome you can, however it needs to be. So that might, between that and David's answer on the specification, I think that might cover what you're asking about the contract specification.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think everybody is quiet. Okay, so if there is no more question, then before closing this webinar, let me recommend you to save the date for our next REMOURBAN webinar, which will take place on February the 11th at 2 o'clock if you join us from the UK, Ireland and Portugal, or at 3 o'clock if you will join us from Northern, Central and Southern Europe. So stay tuned to our communication channels because more details will be published soon, very soon. And thank you very much for your participation. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you also to Yuris for the platform, and thank you to Fernando for the preparation from the Steinbeis Europa Zentrum side. And I wish you all to have a nice week.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.